Hey everyone, welcome to my podcast. Today is really special. I have an amazing guest here with me right now. I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Sevin Yeltekin to my show. She's the Dean of the Simon Business School at the University of Rochester. Dean Yeltekin is a highly respected macroeconomic scholar. She is well known for her research that spans fiscal policy design, social insurance design, computational economics, and the asset pricing implications of macro policy. She received master's and PhD degrees in economics from Stanford University. Dean Yeltkin has served as an associate editor of multiple academic journals, including Quantitative Economics, Operations Research, Journal of Monetary Economics, and the Macroeconomics Dynamics. She is a frequent contributor to Bloomberg Market Radios and U.S. News as an expert on macroeconomics trends and policies. Dr. Yeltkin, thank you so much for being here today. It's a great honor to have you on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be on the show.
Yeah, Professor, I think you probably follow the news. And last Friday, Moody finally announced that they downgraded the U.S. credit ratings from AAA to AA1. This means the U.S. government no longer have the highest credit rating from any of the big three credit rating firms. Why do you think Moody chose this moment for a final downgrade?
Well, I think it's a reaction to the bill that has been being passed in terms of the bill that comes with a lot of tax cuts that
Mhm.
will actually increase the US government deficit. And one has to understand that for for much of its history, the U.S. has built a credible and safe asset for not
Mhm.
just American nationals, but foreign nationals, foreign companies, and a lot of times foreign governments to invest in, which is our
Mhm.
government bond market. And it is always seen as a safe haven. It always had that very high credit rating, and that's not an easy thing to establish. US has never missed a payment on its
Mhm.
obligations, has that incredible credibility. But we have been running large deficits. We do have a large debt to GDP ratio, even surpassing that of what we experienced during World War II, which was a high mark. And there's a lot of concern about the sustainability and of that kind of spending and those kinds of deficits,
Mhm.
the US economy's ability to meet its obligations, especially in a high inflation environment. One other way to interpret the timing is also a signal from the market to try to influence the outcome of the discussions.
Mhm.
So it's not just reactionary, but also trying to put a voice in there saying this is not a good idea. We are worried about the sustainability of US government debt and debt markets. You might want to rethink this particular bill.
Yeah. And also Moody's mentioned like there's a couple of factors in making that decision. They talk about the current debt size US government has, the interest burden, which is like surpassing the spending on the defense, and also the potential political gridlock. Which factor do you think is most damaging, like in kind of triggering this decision?
So I think about those three. I want to be a little bit clear about the second one that you mentioned,
Mhm.
which is the interest burden. I actually have written a couple of papers about this. The way that we measure the interest burden, or even the government actually puts down the interest payments, the total interest payments that we
Mhm.
pay on government debt, is not how we economists think about interest. So it's a little bit overstated. And the reason it's overstated is that in that interest payments is both the coupons, which are pure interest payments that we
Mhm.
make on notes and bonds, and at the same time, the principal payments, the face value that we pay on maturing debt. So it's a
Yeah.
combination of principal and interest payments.
Mhm.
So we need to disentangle that a little bit. But the main point stays, which is that it's been rising over time
Yeah.
and it is a cause for concern. So I think the sustainability issue is a huge issue. Bond
Mhm.
markets do not like large deficits. Bond markets do not like large risk premiums attached to it. And the US economy has been an engine. Its engine of growth has been investment, and it's innovation. And if you have very high interest rates or government spending and government's desire to borrow, basically squeezing out and displacing private borrowing, then it's going to affect investment and future growth. Well, I think Moody's and everybody else is quite honestly worried about fundamentally.
Yeah. How do you think the downgrade effect will affect the long-run pricing power in the U.S. Treasuries?
It's a signal. I mean, I think it's going to certainly make people think about looking for other safe assets. Now, there isn't a lot of alternatives, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
If you look at kind of the UK markets, you look at any kind of, some of the G7 markets, I mean, there's a couple of issues. It's not clear to me that they're handling their debts very well.
Yeah.
Second of all, those markets are not as large as the US market. You have to sort of look at the scale of the US market. So if you're a large institutional investor or multiple large institutional investors, you start going, towards other types of markets. There isn't even volume that is going to be able to not alone, let alone the risk, but also the volume that can support the size that we have experienced in the US market.
Yeah.
So it's going to be, and one other thing I would say is that while this is a bill that's now passed through the Congress and it's headed to the Senate, the past few months have also shown us that there is a policy sort of decisions made, whether it's tariffs, whether it's about this bill, where the initial foray is very large and big, but then eventually where it settles down is a smaller tariff or a smaller reach. So I think the markets are also trying to assess, where is this really going to end up? What is really the pragmatic? So you see them responding, understandably, but you don't see them panicking or responding very heavily. And I think it's because they're also assessing, where really will be the steady state.
Yeah. Thank you. So as we know, that snowball effect, we have the rising yield, and we also have the fiscal policy problem. So the current rising yield is definitely added to additional fiscal policy. So when you see there's a current 10-year yield hovering around like 4.5 and 5%, how much like counter-cyclical space does Washington still have?
In terms of doing some sort of policy interventions, not much. One thing I would say is that we saw a very extreme and stark example of this during Liz Truss's term, right, in the UK, where the Bank of England had announced a high interest, and they were trying to have what we call a contractionary monetary policy to try to get inflation under control. And then all of a sudden, Liz Truss's government came in with this very expansionary fiscal policy. And then the two sides, the monetary and fiscal policy, ended up being at odds with each other. And the Bank of England had to backtrack some of its anti-inflationary, contractionary measures and try to accommodate the markets, because the bond market and the stock markets there also reacted really badly. And then at the end, it was, it ousted the Liz Truss's government. The political mechanisms in the US are different, but when we see that kind of yield pressure, it's really squeezing the Fed's ability to be able to fight inflation.
So do you think like there could be a simultaneous fiscal and monetary pressure led to a Treasury and Fed policy collisions?
It would be extremely detrimental to the economy. And it's, as we know, is a double-edged sword. So if these high anticipated deficits increase interest rates and increase and squeeze out investment and borrowing in an extremely sizable way, that we start dipping the economy into a recession, the Fed is going to have to track back
Mm-hmm.
and or be pressured to track back and do a more expansionary monetary policy, try to reduce or tilt the yield curve the way that they've done during the 2008 and 9 recession, to try to kind of use the maturity of what they buy and what they sell to try to hit the yield curve. But at the same time, we have brought down inflation, but it's not quite stabilized to that 2%. Plus, with the tariffs, inflation is likely to stay pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
So fighting those two monsters is going to be really hard.
Yeah. And my feeling about the current government's policy is like, on the good side, you're raising the tariff on all the goods imported into US. And, US doesn't manufacture a lot of goods, like we import most of them. And that definitely create inflation pressure. At the same time, I believe the immigration office is like trying to push away all the undocumented workers, like those workers working in the service industry. And that could create a service inflation pressure as well. So from all these angles, I just don't see like there's definitely a direction for the higher inflation in the coming years. What do you think about that? Like,
Yeah, I mean, the pressures are there for sure. The pressures are there, and it's going to be very, very difficult for the Fed to try to navigate this world, the world of rising prices due to tariffs and other, the expansionary fiscal policy, at the same time trying to stabilize the economy, at the same time making sure that the fluctuations in the bond market not that it's directly the Fed's job to manage the bond market, that is the Treasury's job, but the Fed is a big holder of US bonds, and especially since 2008 and 2009. And they have to think about how to manage their interest rate policy. It's, whichever way you go, you're stepping on a bit of a landmine, and that's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what do you think could be the possible options for the government? Like you have the option of raising tax, which I know the government is apparently not doing. They are trying to reduce the tax. They can cut spending. They can also do structural reform. Which path do you think looks feasible before the 2026 midterm election?
Oh, what's feasible versus what's optimal?
Yeah.
That's always a question we have to ask
Yeah.
ourselves as economists, don't we? I think what should be done is not to have these large tax cuts. What should be done is certainly back away from trade wars and things like that. What is possibly going to be feasible is that maybe some of these tax cuts or these large deficit, spending bill will get trimmed down a little bit. As far as spending cuts are concerned, funnily enough, even with Dodge in effect, we didn't see a big spending cut.
Yeah.
The kinds of trillions of dollars that were mentioned in the beginning of the new administration. First of all, our discretionary spending as a government is not that large, right? A
Yeah.
lot of things are entitlements or appropriations. So even if they were trying to cut those, then they get challenged in court, and they get challenged in various domains, because it's really in the power of Congress to dole out those appropriations, not really by executive order. So I don't see a lot of spending cuts happening. I don't see structural reform happening. So in terms of what's feasible, maybe trimming down that very large tax cut.
Reduction. So if the deficit keep expanding and treasury funding tilt toward shorter maturities to kind of reduce the interest burden, do we risk a duration mismatch crisis?
Probably. I mean, my take is that even with the big, really large sort of tariff imposition earlier in the year, as soon as the bond market reacted badly, that was walked back.
Yeah.
I'm trying to answer your question with a pragmatic approach of thinking about how far they're really willing to go. And I do
Yeah.
think that, not that we want to play this action rinksmanship, but I do think that larger fluctuation in the bond market, more risk, more money leaving the US to go towards other countries,
Mhm.
a desire to get out of the dollar, all of those things combined is going to make this administration to rethink how far
Mhm.
they're willing to push.
Yeah. We know there's a transmission chain from rating to the household and firms, right? Because the Moody's cut the ratings of the US credit rating, and that will definitely add pressure to increase the 10-year note yield. And that would transfer to the household. Like household is going to borrow money to buy houses and the auto loans, all those business, you're going to have borrow money to either buy back their shares or do additional investment. So how do you think about this transmission chain is going to have this impact on the business?
So, in terms of businesses who have to borrow, absolutely. I mean, this is going to be very difficult or expensive capital markets if you need to do borrowing, whether you're
Mhm.
trying to get a mortgage, whether you're trying to launch a business or grow a business. Now, there's an effect that's going in the opposite direction as well. A lot of these tax cuts are going to be especially beneficial for high earners,
Mm.
and they have a lot of spending power.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, you're giving a fiscal relief to a high spend ability population. So, where do we end up in net? I do think that it's going to affect business formation and business investment and housing investment. That's going to be the negatives.
Mhm.
What I worry about this the most is what I'm trying to describe, which is what I think of as compositional effects. So the middle class, the lower income class, small businesses, startups, growing businesses who need access to capital markets are going to be disproportionately compared to those who have large retained earnings, large cash reserves, and large incomes.
So I believe like the investment officer in Goldman Sachs, he wrote a book and he believed that US is going to a high rate and a low growth scenario. And which industry do you think will show leverage stress first?
I mean, we're seeing it already, right? A lot of the
Mhm.
private equity and we're seeing it in sort of funding of startups, which is also linked to the scientific and innovation community, which is
Mhm.
also the fundings have been decreasing over there. A lot of these sort of small tech startups are going to feel the squeeze in terms of not being able to raise funding for their startup activity.
Mhm.
We're going to see it hugely because they're getting the double whammy in things like pharmaceutical and healthcare innovation space.
So do you think there could be an asset balance sheet recession replay in the United States like what happened in 2008? And would be that risk?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people hold, right? It's you're holding bonds and the yields on those things are going to go up and the price or the value of them are going to come down.
Mhm.
It depends on, I mean, I think we're less leveraged now than we were in 2008, 2009.
Mhm.
Hopefully we've learned our lesson and there's been new, kind of oversight and regulations around that. But at the same time, it is becoming harder and harder. We do see an uptick in delinquency rates. We're seeing
Mhm.
an uptick in sort of default rates and foreclosures. I think our starting point is a bit better than before 2008,
Mhm.
but the policy changes right now are, if they go through in the way that they are designed initially, are pretty large and impactful.
Yeah. I don't know if you track the CLO market, which is like a collateral debt obligation
Mm-hmm.
kind of platform. And I think they did some financial engineering. They're just saying, oh, this corporate, if we kind of correlate, like do some financial engineering, we create this vehicle that's like have hundreds of, if not thousands of companies debt in this. It's basically you can rate it as a triple A like rating because of the correlation issue. But if the current policy continues, the interest rate of the 10-year note continue to rise, you're going to see a lot of problem like similar to 2008. Like all these companies are correlated together. If the economic take a downturn, and we're going to see probably a similar
Systemic
problem.
risk.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think the last question regarding the US side is the capital flows after downgrade. So do we think the faith in the dollar has actually been eroded after all this new administration's policy announcement?
I think it's certainly taken a bit of a hit, whether it's really eroded. I mean, I'm a macroeconomist, so I tend to take a sort of a longer historical view about these things.
Mm-hmm.
When the euro was first introduced, when, Chinese yuan and China entered into the global markets more and Chinese yuan was traded more. I mean, there was a lot of talk about kind of replacing the US dollar.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really get to see those realized. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to happen in the future. Again, it is very much the largest traded currency to this date. Even its value has eroded a little bit over the last few months. It's going to be very difficult. We talked about the US bond market having this scale that is hard to replace anywhere else. And same thing applies here. Everything from commodity markets to almost all international loans and transactions are done in, as benchmarked in the US dollar.
Yeah.
Benchmark to US interest rates most of the time as well. So, what does a new paradigm like that? I think the tipping point is far away, but at the same time, any substitution away from the US dollar means that the US no longer has a interest-free loan it's getting from other countries. So that's detrimental to US finances.
Yeah. So I actually am curious about your opinion. So I have recently read a book. It's called Trade War is Class War. I don't know if you read that book. The one argument they have is the dollar reserve currency role in the world actually hurts US more than the benefit US, because the argument is because of a strong dollar, the US manufacturing companies are not competitive globally, and they're like really have to move their manufacturing site to other countries. And that creates lots of problems we currently see in the United States regarding like middle class shrinkage. You don't have a strong base there, and you have the rise of a political descent towards the elite class. What do you think about that argument? Do you think that has any merit?
A little bit, not too
much. A little bit, not too much.
and here is why, because it's a bunch of stuff, and it assumes causality where causality doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And be a little bit clearer about that. So, this idea that if we can somehow make the US dollar less strong, then that's going to flip around or at least help our trade deficit, which will then in turn help our, some of our employment or income distribution issues in the United States. Those really don't have a lot of empirical or theoretical backing. At the end of the day, where the trade deficits come from, they come the difference between savings, national savings, and investment, the disparity between the two. US government doesn't save very much. They're running huge deficits.
Yeah.
US households are notoriously low savers. Why? Well, because they have access to capital markets at low interest rates historically, so they don't have to save so much. And the same thing is true for US companies. If you look at the national savings rate in the US, compare it to, say, Japan, China, a few of the other, especially I would say Asian countries, we look like the biggest spenders on earth, right? But that's about consumerism. It's about the fact that the first thing you learn in economics is the sort of consumption smoothing that we do, and how we tilt people's desire to save and desire to invest by looking at intertemporal interest rates. And the same thing is true here. The US economy has enjoyed for a very long time access to very cheap credit that the global economy was willing to provide.
Yeah.
And so it's not really about the US dollar's value. There's no such thing as sort of like the true value of the US dollar. It's not even about who does manufacturing where.
Yeah.
What it is really about is who saves and who invests. US has always invested a lot. That's fueled growth. And then, but they save very much, so somebody has to make the difference. You know, even if we change the trade deficit between US and China or US and Canada and Mexico, because that savings and investment hasn't adjusted, we're just going to, it's like a mole. The deficit in some other country is going, another country is going to go up. Now, the compositional effect that you're talking about, which is it has this disproportionate, globalization has this disproportionate effect on certain income classes and certain skill classes. That's absolutely true. That is absolutely. But the question one has to ask is the answer to that, the solution to really tariffs and manipulating the US dollar that comes at a huge cost itself? Or do we need a different type of both a social network and social, and sort of labor market support to answer the questions of this? I worked a lot on policy. You cannot try to use a giant, clumsy hammer to hit a tiny nail. I'm not saying that the compositional effects are tiny. They're huge, and especially those who are experiencing them. But you got to have the right instrument for the right problem. Otherwise, you're just making more damage.
Yeah. I do want to give also some credit because he also argued that because the dollar has a strong reserve currency position and a lot of foreign investors, they want to find safe haven asset, and they're just like pouring all the money they got through their trade surplus into the US bond market, which artificially lower the interest rate for all the borrowers like in US. And that kind of create this distortion effect, which the US citizens, they can access this low cost borrowing and they don't form the habit of saving, and they kind of eventually form this bubble in the asset, and then the whole debt problem kind of erupt, and you have this 2008 again, and all those people who over leverage, they lose their homes, they lose their jobs, and they suffer most from that. So that's his whole argument on this.
Yeah, and again, I agree with bits of that, and I disagree with bits of it in the sense that I don't necessarily view it as, I mean, it's an interesting corporate finance problem, right? In the sense that we are, from abroad to then basically buy a piece of productive asset that's a factory that sits in China. You have to wrap your head around that. But I view it as a vicious cycle. I mean, this is what globalization has brought to us. It's just that we specialize. We specialize in highly manufactured, assets and services and technology and healthcare products. Other countries specialize in other things. They pay us for those services. We then go ahead and buy their manufactured goods. Now, the compositional effects in terms of who gets the benefit most from that and who doesn't are very important social questions we need to answer. But I don't view it as an overall vicious cycle. I view it as a part of sort of how markets work, but we know that markets are about efficiency. They're not about equality. So if we want to then undo some of those distortions that disproportionately affects one portion of the population versus another, we need to find the right policy instruments for that.
Yeah, I agree. I think we definitely need to think about like the distribution effect inside the U.S. Government spending, right? How we kind of shift some of the who win from the global trading, and then to those who kind of lost, and then compensate them, right?
And then on top of it, if you're proposing a tax bill that's going to disproportionately benefit high earners and it's going to
Yeah.
cut Medicaid and Medicare. Wow,
Yeah.
now you're really piling on, right?
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I was kind of like curious to see the midterm election result because I think some of the people who support the current administration may have a wake-up call, like when they see their benefit actually goes away instead of increasing. Okay, let's shift gear. Let's move to the topics about China because I think we actually debated this before about the Chinese debt ratio. For different companies, different agency, different institutions, they have different ratings on the debt to GDP estimate. The official data is like 60%, but like for example, Goldman Sachs gave about 140, and the Chinese policy banks gave about 80%, and the UBS gave about 125%. Why do you see this such a difference from different agencies give these ratings?
A lot of it depends on the definition and where they collect the data from. There's
Mhm.
also a little bit of, in general, difficulty with comparing government debt or government deficits across countries. And here's
Mhm.
why. It's not just a sort of a Chinese phenomenon. Even when we think about sort of the US, right, we think about versus state and local. So when we talk about the US government debt, we throw the word government around, but what we really mean is the
Yeah.
federal debt. But then when you go to other countries, a federated system is not a very common system. It's a very different, right? Few countries have a federal system.
Mhm.
So then you have to find the analog in the other countries. And then sometimes we try to look at sort of what's called central
Mhm.
government as opposed to kind of local government, right?
Mhm.
So in
Yeah.
some of these, I imagine they're consolidating local with central. In some of those, they're not. In some of
Mhm.
these, the data sources are not very reliable. So it's a combination of a few different things.
Yeah. But like I think because of this number, there could be arguments saying, oh, the Chinese actually under levered compared to US and Japan. But in other terms, they are comparable, even like they have a higher debt to GDP ratio for China compared to US and China.
Yeah.
Which Japan, which side do you think that makes more sense?
So I'm going to nitpick a little bit because,
Mhm.
I don't want to call anybody under or over leveraged because
Mhm.
it all depends, just like a individuals or a household's ability. I can look like I have borrowed, 200% of
Mhm.
relative to my income. But that's not just based on where I am now, it's my ability to produce income in the future, right?
Yeah.
So when you look at countries like not Greece, let's say, which had a debt crisis, but you look at countries like Argentina, which had multiple debt crises,
Mhm.
you'll see that even at the times of their crisis, their debt to GDP ratio wasn't that high. If you look at Spain, which and went down with the Greek debt crisis, you will also see that their debt to GDP ratio wasn't that high. So it's not. So we have to be really careful interpreting those numbers
Mhm.
because it's about your ability to finance that debt and ability to borrow.
Mhm.
The reason, at the same time, right, we look at Japan and what is it now, like 225%?
Yeah, it's crazy high level.
Right, but we're not having a podcast about Japan. Why?
Yeah.
Because is it the ability bar? It's how it's structured, who holds it. There's a lot of different things. So I don't
Mhm.
want to call anything under or over leveraged. It depends a lot. Comparing those numbers is a very tricky thing to do.
Mhm.
Um, it depends on what is the Chinese government's ability to borrow, who holds
Mhm.
this debt, who
Yeah.
what makes it vulnerable, right? What's the risk premium on that? Those are the kinds of things that we would talk about. Now, the general point of such large variations in what has been estimated is a little bit is a little worrying.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, you got to have the right data to be able to tackle problems, and we want to know whether we're at 80% or 140%.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. One of the tricky part about estimating the debt to GDP ratio is China has a lot of local government financing,
Exactly.
and their book are not that clear. They set up kind of vehicles of fundraising and for the local investment,
Right.
and they do all this kind of infrastructure building, and it's really hard to estimate how much really real debt among those local government.
Exactly. And then you have to look at sort of who holds it.
Yeah.
And then you have to look at what is the ability of these even local governments and the central government to be able to. I mean, the concern with China is that its economic growth started to slow down. And if it's entering a paradigm in which it's going to look more like an advanced economy where you're not going to see 9, 10, 8% growth rates, right? You're going to see a more steady 3% growth rate. Well, then we have to think about, what's our ability to finance that debt.
Yeah. So, recently we have this real estate downturn in China. I wouldn't call it as a 2008 moment for China, but it's like you see some similarity there. The real estate price start to decline, and a lot of household, they have their properties upside down. Like their equity in the house is actually below the level they have for the some people just give up the payment. They stop paying the house, and the house got sold on the open market by the court. So how do you think about this downturn kind of hit the repayment capacity, particularly
It's
on the local
hugely
government?
problematic, right? I mean, it's you have folks who have invested large amounts of their income and wealth in these markets, including developers. That collapse, I mean, it's a huge negative wealth effect. A negative wealth effect translates into a negative consumption effect, which is going to bring down the economy even more, especially when you are facing tariffs in some of your largest markets, and you have to rely on a domestic market to be pretty strong and resilient. So then you're going to have to make up for those differences with possibly even more government spending, and then you can see where that vicious cycle starts, right? The debt goes up. The most important, I would say, lesson from this is a lesson we try to teach all of our students, right? Which is one, putting all your egg in one basket type of thing. This is not a very diversified portfolio, right? When you just invest so much on property rather than other places. And this is a misallocation of resources, it turns out, right? Because a lot of these secondary and tertiary cities, while lots of real estate went up, the jobs and the industries that would support that population didn't move to those secondary and tertiary cities at scale. So that's a misallocation, right? People bet on this to happen, and it didn't happen, and now the value of those things are coming down. So it's a lesson about, how do we actually kind of have an investment policy or an investment attitude and access to capital markets that give us a more diversified future look.
I know the Chinese government want to encourage spending because they think like right now they can no longer sustain the past 20 to 30 years investment driven growth. Do you think that's like any kind of policy that's feasible to kind of increase the internal spending? Because the household currently have this real estate problem. They have the negative wealth effect. A lot of people, they turn to more saving instead of like spending more.
Well, I mean, that's short-lived, right? If you just want to stimulate the economy by consumption, that's short-lived as well. Because if you're not creating income, it's certainly true that capital investment, physical capital investment like this, right? Whether it's factories or whether it's this real estate market, China has done an enormous amount of it, grew very, very rapidly. I was in Shanghai not too long ago, and it was remarkable to see that, just not this January, but the January before, to see that everything, especially in the new, the large parts of the town, was built in 30 years. I mean, that's remarkable. It's mesmerizing and remarkable at the same time. And at the same time, you think, well, okay, you've built it now, and that pace cannot be sustained, right?
Yeah.
And if it's not being sustained by this sort of large amounts of physical capital increases, then you have to shift your economy to other things like the US has done, like the European economies have done, towards services, towards other, and China has been doing that. I mean, it is now, if you look at the breakdown of GDP, it is more of a service economy, even though it still has a large manufacturing sector, especially given its size, it's still a very large manufacturing powerhouse globally.
Yeah.
If you look at the of GDP, services is a larger part of the Chinese economy now than manufacturing is.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's a natural way that most developed countries have evolved over time. And so so it's not so much, I would say, trying to get people to consume more, especially when they've had a negative wealth shock with prices declining, because how can you sustain that? You're going to have to incentivize people to spend, which means you're going to have to spend money to get them to spend, which is, where does that end? It's more about able to give vehicles of investment and income that are more diversified.
Yeah, I totally agree. I actually look at the trend of the Chinese manufacturing portion. I agree with what you observed. Like the portion of that in the total economy is continues in a declining trend. Like the service is increasing and people are kind of shifting towards more high value add jobs and professions. So I definitely see that a lot of like low end manufacturing are no longer competitive in China. They move to the Southeast Asia, and then those lower wage income countries. So
exactly. That's something natural, right? I mean, like trying to natural in the sense that that's how economic development plays in, evolves over time. We've seen that in the UK, we've seen that in the US historically, and China now has its own version of it. And instead of thinking about trying to turn the tide back, trying to swim up the stream, right? You have to think about, okay, that was a phase, that was a great growth phase, and incredible milestones have been reached in terms of income per capita, in terms of development. We're entering a new phase now. And in that new phase, what does spending, investment, industrial policy, global policy look like?
Yeah.
And I'm sure they're doing that. I mean,
smart. So let's shift gear a little bit. Looking at the Chinese current debt problem, I know the central government has this three debt workout strategy, right? They try this debt swap mechanism. They also do a special purpose bond, and they do the asset injection. Which do you think can be most effective in solving the current Chinese debt problem?
Honestly, I don't know if you'll be satisfied with my answer, but it's going to be none of them.
Okay.
and the reason I say that, and this is, I know, drives non-economists, but it's really you're off various benefits with various costs, and it depends on how much weight you place on one versus the other. So, you can have these special purpose bonds, but then you're, again, instead of letting markets choose where the investment should go, you're directing it.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, a little bit of direction is fine. That's what policy is, interventions are. We have to be really careful about that because it can lead to some misallocations. If you're doing asset injections, asset management companies handling distressed debt, and again, you have to be a little bit sort of state-owned enterprises, equity transfers. You're bailing them out in some sense.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
I mean, that means you're creating bad incentives for the future. And you have to pay for that as well. The debt swap mechanism, again, you have to incentivize people and you have to show them that, okay, you can swap this medium term 3 to 5 year debt for 7 to 10 years. But if you want to liquidate things in 8 years and not hold it to maturity, you got to incentivize me to hold that. I don't know that necessarily I'm going to be in any better position 8 years from now as opposed to 4 years from now.
Exactly.
So then I need a premium. Unless I'm forced to swap, I need a premium.
Yeah.
And who's going to pay for that premium? So they're all in our toolboxes.
Hmm.
They're not perfect tools. They all have their, you know, porcupine quills that come back to bite you.
Yeah. So, Professor, do you think China actually faced a similar problem Japan had like in the 80s? But you have the banking kind of take the direction from the government, say, hey, lend to this special companies. Those companies going to get most of the borrowing capacity, and then those debt become like bad debt, and they have to solve this problem. And now the Japan, their way is just hide it, pretend it's not there, and then not do much and try to lower the interest rate. That's what they try to been doing. Do you think China faces a similar problem?
I hope not. And I think one of the things about, um, silver lining about being an emerging market and going through these phases a little bit later than others have done is that we can learn from their mistakes. There were a lot of giant conglomerates in China that had kind of moved bad debt around inside themselves, hiding the
Hmm.
amount of leverage, hiding the amount of bad performing investments, and throwing good money at bad projects and bad debt.
Hmm.
I do hope that that's not what's really happening. I mean, there's certainly a misallocation with the real estate market there,
Hmm.
but I do hope that it is not an easy problem to solve, but it's not being hidden under the carpet either.
Yeah.
And I think a there's a way of thinking about and planning for the future that I see in China than maybe what we saw in the 80s and
Hmm.
in 90s in Japan. But I would have to have a lot more information to be able to tell you that. I just hope that we don't see that kind of stagnation in China that we saw in Japan for two and a half decades.
Yeah. I definitely see there's some difference in the, the, how to say, the economy because China nowadays they have like pretty new innovations coming out, like the drones, the batteries, the electric vehicles, and the Chinese government call it the big three. So those industries do have very competitive strengths compared to other competitors around the globe. What do you think about those? Like, can China kind of continue to fund those innovations and try to kind of grow out of this debt problem? If you have retained a strong growth, the debt may not be a problem because you can repay them.
Exactly. I mean, that's, at the end of the day, you really want to make sure that you're not stifling growth.
Hmm.
I mean, the problem with sort of what happened with Japan, with the misallocation of good money to existing bad debt is that you're stifling good investment.
Hmm.
Um, you know, what's China able to do, which is remarkable, I think, is being able to provide highly engineered high goods
Hmm.
at a much more palatable price.
Yes.
Look at the phone industry, right?
Yeah, exactly.
iPhones are ridiculously expensive. For a lot
Yeah.
of people, they're not in their budget set.
Yeah.
Um, and then China comes up with alternatives that are fantastic and much more affordable.
Hmm.
Same thing with electric cars. Same thing with a lot of sort of highly engineered products. And I think there is a remarkable value to that you can reach a larger, deeper, wider market
Hmm.
with these well engineered products. Um, it's not your basic toys and widgets and so on.
Yeah.
These are highly engineered, highly technical products, but doing it at a price point that is not burdensome, not as
Yeah.
burdensome anyway. And I think there's huge value to that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at, I mean, I just bought an electric vehicle about 6, 7 months ago,
Uh-huh.
and you know, um, I live in a small city here in Rochester, so there aren't a lot of dealerships that had electric cars. I would have loved to have had access to some of the ones that have been made in China
China. Yeah.
with a joint venture between Chinese companies and European companies. They look
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. So I think we already covered this credit stress to the real economy. We can move on to the final question on China, which is RMB internationalization and shifting capital flows. So, China want to make the RMB like the reserve currency, which dollar is doing right now. So there are some issues with that. What do you think the bottleneck is for the Chinese government to reach this ambition?
Well, huge capital controls right now, right? I mean, they don't,
Hmm.
it's not really a fully convertible, fully tradable currency at the moment.
Hmm.
And part of that is because with these capital controls, then the Chinese government is able to have a global trade policy, global kind of reserve policy, and things like that. So
Hmm.
to be able to reach that global reserve status, you got to be able to let one is the currency trade more freely. Now,
Hmm.
that means you're going to open it up to more risk, right? It can go up
Yeah,
and down. And so you're going to have to be able to stomach that while you build this large network of supply but right now, being able to convert your renminbi to US dollars and taking it out of China is difficult. It's tightly controlled.
exactly.
And it's not so if people want to invest but then they want to reap their investments, move it somewhere else, you got to make those transaction costs and barriers much smaller, so it's doable. And
Hmm.
I think they're going to continue to play a larger and larger role and as a currency in the global markets, but it will have to come at the expense of releasing some of the control, which means it will fluctuate more, which means that there'll be less control over what we call terms of trade, which is how you make your goods relatively cheap compared to other goods who you're competing against.
Hmm.
There is some give and take there.
Yeah. So I know Beijing is like slowing down its accumulation of the US treasuries and they want to issue more offshore. They call it a panda bonds, which is like the bonds denominated RMB, right? So what do you think are the bottleneck for doing that? Like, do you think is that easy for China to issue RMB based bond? Would the investor be interested in that kind of
Yeah, I mean, you can
investment
certainly
product?
issue whatever you want, but you have to. It's a lot of these things. It's not what you say that we call cheap talk in
Hmm.
economics. It's about, I mean, establishing a very solid foundation for doing good. You have to show that you have transparent and good fiscal policy, that you
Hmm.
have a sustainable path of debt issuance, that you have the scale and flexibility of the markets for people to be able to trade when they want to trade, when they want
Hmm.
to liquidate. If you look at the UK, you look at US, the two countries where bond markets are extremely active and attractive,
Hmm.
it took them 100 years to establish that.
Yeah.
China can accelerate that. It doesn't need to take 100 years.
Yeah.
There were a lot of wars that had to be financed in between,
Yeah.
but it's a marathon. It's not you can speed it up, but you're not going to be able to establish it overnight. And a lot of
Hmm.
it has to do with how well you manage it and how credible you got to build that credibility, that flexibility, and that reputation.
Yeah, I think like the Chinese government definitely have that ambition to push more RMB, become more international, and then have issue more panda bonds so people will use RMB to buy those bonds, and then you create a similar cycle to what UK and the US does with their bond. So I
Yeah,
think like that's what we want to follow.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
it's very, very important.
Yeah. Professors, thank you so much for your time. So even though we're not talking about Japan, but I still have one last question I want to ask you about Japan because recently, I don't know if you followed the yield, like Japanese 30-year yield number is like skyrocketing. It's on a strong upper trend recently. Do you know like what causes that? Is that some trader got over leveraged and blow up?
Honestly, I'll be very honest. I have not been watching that very closely.
Uh,
So maybe next time we can talk about it because
yeah.
I don't want
Okay.
to give any kind of half-baked answer that's not quite correct.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate your time here. I think this podcast will be very valuable to my audience, and really thank you for your time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.